In today's episode, we are going to look at the 6 worst deaths caused by food ever recorded, from a family cooking and eating poisonous frogs together to a neglected toddler left alone during a risky feeding moment in the cruelest way possible. It was September 18, 2014. Rural Nueva Ecija province in the Philippines stretched under gray monsoon skies, the rice paddies waterlogged from 2 weeks of flooding that had devastated harvests across the region. Rogelio Icatlo, a 41-year-old tenant farmer, stood knee-deep in muddy water outside his small concrete block home, knowing his family's food supply was running dangerously low. Rogelio had worked rice fields his entire adult life, renting 7 hectares from a landowner who took 60% of each harvest. The recent typhoon had destroyed most of his standing crop, leaving him with almost no income until the next planting season. His wife, Lena, 38, worked occasional laundry jobs, but money was scarce. Their 3 children, aged 6, 9, and 12, had been eating mostly rice porridge for days. Foraging supplemented their diet during lean times. Wild plants, snails, and field frogs were common protein sources for poor farming families throughout the province. Rogelio had caught frogs dozens of times before, usually the common brown paddy frogs that thrived in flooded fields. That afternoon, Rogelio decided to collect frogs to feed his family. The flooding had brought out numerous amphibians, and he spotted what appeared to be good-sized specimens near the irrigation ditch. What Rogelio didn't know was how to properly distinguish between edible paddy frogs and toxic Asian black-spined toads. The toads, when mud-covered and small, looked nearly identical to young frogs, especially to someone not trained in species identification. He spent an hour collecting 12 amphibians, dropping them into a plastic bucket. Several were actually toads, their distinctive spiny backs obscured by thick mud. Back home, Lena helped skin and clean them, a process that should have revealed the toad's different skin texture and parotid glands, but neither parent recognized the danger. She seasoned them with salt and garlic, then fried everything in a shared pan, unaware that the heat would not destroy the toxin. The family ate together at 6 in the evening, the children excited to have meat with their rice. Within 40 minutes, catastrophe struck. The youngest child suddenly vomited violently across the table, then began drooling uncontrollably. Her small body went rigid, muscles seizing as bufatoxin spread rapidly through her system. Rogelio doubled over with crushing abdominal pain that felt like his stomach was tearing apart. Lena's heart began thumping in heavy, irregular patterns, pounding unevenly before she collapsed onto the concrete floor. The 9-year-old, still conscious but trembling, ran screaming to the neighbor's house. The neighbor immediately called the rural health station, but the nearest ambulance was 40 minutes away. Another neighbor helped load the family into his motorized tricycle, racing toward the town clinic about 9.5 miles away. In the cramped sidecar, Rogelio convulsed violently, white foam bubbling from his mouth as cardiac toxins disrupted his heart rhythm. The youngest child stopped breathing entirely before they reached the main highway. Lena's body jerked with irregular spasms, her heart misfiring with each contaminated beat. The local health examiner identified findings consistent with acute bufatoxin poisoning during the preliminary examination. Rogelio was pronounced dead shortly after arrival at the clinic from sudden cardiac arrhythmia. Lena Icatlo suffered repeated ventricular fibrillation and was declared dead less than 30 minutes later despite basic resuscitation attempts. Their 6-year-old daughter was pronounced dead on arrival, having stopped breathing during transport. Medical findings later confirmed fatal cardiac rhythm collapse and multi-organ failure in all 3 victims within 2 hours of ingestion. The 2 older children, aged 9 and 12, survived after emergency stabilization, but suffered permanent neurological damage from oxygen deprivation, including persistent tremors and documented short-term memory impairment. Both were discharged weeks later into the care of extended relatives. It was June 17, 2017. The evening air in Amarillo, Texas was hot and heavy, carrying the smell of grilled meat from a backyard party on the city's south side. What started as a typical Saturday night gathering would end with paramedics desperately working over a lifeless body on sun-scorched grass. Evan Jesus Moraes was 22 years old. He'd dropped out of the local community college after 1 semester, bouncing between delivery jobs and long stretches of unemployment. Friends described him as the guy who would do anything for attention and quick cash. That confidence and desperation, combined with a complete lack of self-preservation, made him a fixture at parties where bored young people gathered to watch someone humiliate themselves for entertainment. Friends said that Evan had earned maybe $200 total from these stunts over the past year, collected from spectators. Speed eating challenges were his specialty. He ate fast, chewed minimally, and relied on alcohol to wash everything down. That evening, someone offered $50 if Evan could finish 3 massive carne asada burritos in under 5 minutes. Each burrito weighed roughly 2 pounds, stuffed with dense beef, rice, beans, and thick flour tortillas. The party host had ordered them from a local Tex-Mex restaurant known for oversized portions. Evan had been drinking heavily since mid-afternoon, his judgment already impaired. Several people warned him the burritos looked dry and difficult to swallow quickly. Evan dismissed them, grabbing the first burrito and tearing into it while someone started a phone timer. He attacked the food with aggressive bites, barely chewing, washing massive mouthfuls down with gulps of beer. His cheeks bulged grotesquely as he forced more food in before swallowing completely. The crowd laughed and filmed, shouting encouragement. Evan gagged twice during the first burrito but powered through. By the second burrito, his pace had slowed noticeably. He was sweating, his face flushed red from exertion and alcohol. Friends later admitted they noticed him struggling but assumed he would stop if it became dangerous. Several people laughed initially, thinking it was part of the performance. Evan stumbled forward and collapsed face first onto the grass, his body rigid. Within seconds, he lost consciousness. As critical seconds ticked by with no air moving, his skin and lips turned cyanotic. Nearly half a minute passed before anyone realized this wasn't a joke. Someone finally moved to help, rolling him over. Evan's eyes were wide and terrified, his mouth open but unable to draw air. After more than a minute of complete oxygen deprivation, his body began to convulse as hypoxia overwhelmed his brain. A partygoer attempted the Heimlich maneuver, but executed it incorrectly, placing force across Evan's ribs instead of performing abdominal thrusts to the diaphragm. Nothing dislodged. As the obstruction remained and oxygen loss continued, Evan's convulsions gradually weakened, then stopped entirely. His eyes remained open but unfocused. Someone called 911 roughly 90 seconds after the obstruction began, long after the narrow window where intervention might have reversed the damage. Paramedics arrived minutes later, finding Evan unresponsive with no pulse. They immediately attempted to clear his airway, removing a densely compacted food bolus of partially chewed tortilla and meat lodged at the upper airway above the trachea. Advanced life support was initiated, but Evan never regained consciousness. The autopsy revealed traumatic impaction and severe soft tissue injury to the pharyngeal and laryngeal structures, along with petechial hemorrhages and cerebral edema from prolonged oxygen deprivation. His blood alcohol content was measured at 0.18%. The cell phone videos were quietly deleted within hours at the family's request. The $50 bet money was left anonymously on his mother's front porch 2 days later. No one from the party attended Evan's funeral. It was March 17, 2016. The small apartment in San Diego's North Park neighborhood was quiet, as Caleb Ritz carefully unrolled the package he'd purchased from a dockside fishmonger earlier that day. Inside was a 3-pound bullseye pufferfish, its spiny body still intact. What should have been a culinary adventure would become one of the most preventable deaths in San Diego County that year. Caleb was a 34-year-old freelance software contractor who lived alone and spent most of his income on food experiences. After a 2-week trip to Tokyo the previous fall, several friends said that he'd become obsessed with Japanese cuisine, particularly the prestige and danger surrounding fugu preparation. Fugu is the Japanese delicacy made from pufferfish, which contains tetrodotoxin in its organs and skin, a neurotoxin considered among the most potent known and requiring chefs to undergo years of training and licensing before they're permitted to serve it commercially. Caleb's apartment walls were covered with photos from Tokyo's Tsukiji fish market. His browser history showed months of research into authentic Japanese cooking techniques, but no formal training whatsoever. That morning, Caleb had driven to a commercial fishing dock where an unlicensed vendor sold him the pufferfish for $60 under the table, with no receipt, no labeling, and no questions asked. The vendor offered no preparation advice and likely hurried the transaction to avoid attention. Caleb returned home and queued up a 14-minute YouTube tutorial video on how to clean the pufferfish. By around 6:30 in the evening, Caleb was 2 hours into preparation. He followed the online tutorial and attempted to remove the toxin-bearing portions himself, unaware that even trace contamination during the process could be fatal. Investigators would later conclude that cross-contamination occurred during handling, leaving lethal toxin on the flesh. He plated 3 pieces of sashimi, admired them for a photo, saved the image to his laptop, and began eating approximately 7 in the evening. At 7:37 in the evening, Caleb texted his friend, "Lips feel weird." His friend responded asking if he was okay, then tried calling when no reply came. By that time, the numbness was spreading rapidly from Caleb's mouth down through his neck and chest. Minutes later, he likely tried to stand, but his legs gave out. He collapsed onto his kitchen floor, laptop still open on the counter showing the paused tutorial video. Tetrodotoxin works by blocking sodium channels in nerve cells, paralyzing voluntary muscles while leaving the victim completely conscious. Caleb lay on the tile floor, unable to move, unable to scream, his eyes open and aware. His diaphragm stopped contracting, his lungs ceased drawing air. His heart continued beating for several minutes as his brain began dying from oxygen starvation. The paralysis was total and silent. His friend became concerned after repeated texts and calls went unanswered. He called 911 at 9:15 in the evening and requested a non-emergency welfare check. Police arrived at 9:40 in the evening and found Caleb still warm to the touch on the kitchen floor. The autopsy later attributed the death to respiratory paralysis caused by tetrodotoxin poisoning, and subsequent toxicology testing confirmed lethal levels of the toxin in tissue samples. Stomach contents revealed toxin-contaminated pufferfish tissue, and a sealed disposal bag recovered from the kitchen was tagged and submitted as evidence. The YouTube video was eventually removed following a platform review tied to the investigation. Digital forensics showed the sashimi photo's embedded timestamp matched browser history and message logs, establishing the sequence of events. Caleb's funeral drew colleagues and online friends. It was May 12, 2018. The afternoon air in Savannah, Georgia hung thick with humidity as guests filled a historic downtown venue for a spring wedding reception. Among the families gathered was the Morales family, including 9-year-old Hannah, who had been managing a severe shellfish allergy since infancy. Hannah was a bright 4th grader at a local elementary school. Known for her love of art class and carefully packed allergen-free lunches her mother prepared daily. Since her first allergic reaction at 18 months, when a bite of contaminated food sent her to the emergency room, Hannah's parents had been vigilant about her condition. They carried epinephrine auto-injectors everywhere, questioned restaurant staff obsessively, and taught Hannah to always ask about ingredients. Her medical alert bracelet never left her wrist. That vigilance had kept her safe for 8 years. Food allergies like Hannah's require constant management. Anaphylaxis can occur within minutes of exposure, causing the immune system to release chemicals that constrict airways, drop blood pressure, and potentially stop the heart. Shellfish proteins can contaminate foods through shared cooking equipment or hidden ingredients like stock bases. For families managing severe allergies, epinephrine auto-injectors represent the critical first line of defense, buying precious time until emergency medical services arrive. That afternoon, the Morales family had confirmed with reception staff that vegetarian pasta options would be available. The rehearsal menu had listed the sauce as cream and herbs, but the staff had not been informed that the chef had prepared it using a shrimp stock base for flavor, a common technique in upscale catering. Hannah's parents, reassured by the vegetarian label, allowed her to eat. The family's epinephrine auto-injector had expired 2 months earlier. Replacement required a new prescription from Hannah's pediatrician, and a costly out-of-pocket expense they were postponing until her scheduled checkup in 3 weeks. The family reasoned that Hannah had not needed the injector in years, and they were careful enough to avoid another delay. On the day of the reception, they had left the expired auto-injector at home in their medicine cabinet, thinking it was non-functional. However, some expired epinephrine auto-injectors can retain partial potency, and even a weakened dose might have slowed the reaction long enough for help to arrive. Hannah ate approximately half her plate before the reaction began. At 3:15 in the afternoon, she started coughing at the family's table. Within 2 minutes, Her breathing became labored and wheezy. She grabbed at her throat as her lips began swelling visibly. Her mother realized immediately what was happening and screamed for help as Hannah's face flushed crimson. The mother immediately called 911. By the time Hannah's father reached her, she had collapsed near the dance floor. Her airway was swelling shut, cutting off oxygen to her brain and vital organs. Wedding guests formed a panicked circle as Hannah's body convulsed, struggling for air that could not reach her lungs. Emergency medical services arrived within 8 minutes. Paramedics immediately administered epinephrine and attempted to establish an airway, but Hannah's throat had swollen nearly closed. Her oxygen saturation had dropped catastrophically. During transport to the regional medical center, her heart stopped from oxygen starvation. Resuscitation efforts continued for 18 minutes without success. The autopsy revealed extreme laryngeal edema and fluid accumulation throughout Hannah's lungs. The medical examiner determined cause of death as anaphylactic shock leading to hypoxic cardiac arrest. Tests later confirmed shrimp proteins in her stomach contents, consistent with ingestion at the reception. Hannah's funeral drew most of the wedding attendees. Her parents established an awareness fund promoting allergen labeling education and providing free epinephrine auto-injectors to families who could not afford replacements. It was November 17, 2013. The kitchen of a modest farmhouse in Yakima, Washington, was filled with the ordinary sounds of Sunday dinner. Marissa Eriks, a 16-year-old junior at a local high school, sat with her family around a table laden with home-preserved vegetables her father had canned 6 months earlier. Marissa was the kind of teenager colleges competed for. She maintained a 4.0 GPA while juggling advanced placement courses, cross-country track, and volunteer work at a community food bank. Friends described her as driven but genuinely kind. Her father, Thomas, had spent the past decade embracing self-sufficiency principles, promoted by various survivalist networks and online preparedness communities. He believed strongly in food independence, converting their garage into a canning operation each summer and filling shelves with preserved vegetables, fruits, and meats. Thomas had learned canning techniques primarily from internet forums and amateur YouTube tutorials, rather than extension office guidelines. That summer, he had processed 47 quarts of green beans, using a standard water bath method instead of pressure canning. Unaware that boiling water reaches only 212 degrees Fahrenheit, while killing botulinum spores requires sustained temperatures of 240 degrees. Extension agents had offered free canning safety workshops throughout Yakima County that season, and printed materials specifically warned against water bath canning for low-acid vegetables. However, the sealed jars showed no bulging lids, no off odors, no visible mold, and he saw no reason for concern when he opened a jar that November evening. Marissa ate a full serving of the green beans at dinner around 6 in the evening. The beans likely tasted slightly off, but nothing alarming enough to stop eating. By noon the next day, she complained of double vision during lunch at school. Her speech began slurring during afternoon classes, prompting her chemistry teacher to send her to the nurse. Marissa insisted she just needed rest, and the school nurse, noting her calm demeanor, advised her to go home rather than call emergency services immediately. By 8 that evening, she could no longer hold her head upright. Thomas watched his daughter's condition deteriorate with growing horror. Her eyelids drooped heavily, unable to fully open. She struggled to swallow water. When she tried to speak, only garbled sounds emerged. Her limbs felt impossibly heavy, then stopped responding to her commands entirely. The paralysis crept methodically downward through her body, shutting down muscle function while leaving her mind completely alert and aware. Thomas delayed calling for help, assuming she would recover if he kept her comfortable, unaware that botulism antitoxin needed to be administered as soon as possible. By midnight, Marissa lay in bed fully conscious but unable to move or communicate. Her breathing became increasingly labored as her diaphragm muscles weakened. She could feel every desperate attempt to draw air becoming more difficult, her chest refusing to expand. Thomas finally called emergency services at 12:40 in the morning, 18 hours after dinner, when he realized she was suffocating. Paramedics arrived within 11 minutes and attempted to provide mechanical ventilation, while notifying the regional hospital to prepare antitoxin treatment. Despite resuscitation efforts, Marissa was pronounced dead at 2:15 in the morning. The autopsy revealed no physical injuries, no signs of trauma or disease. Clinical presentation strongly suggested botulism, and confirmatory laboratory testing for botulinum toxin on Marissa's serum and leftover green beans later returned positive. Death was attributed to respiratory failure caused by foodborne botulism from improperly canned vegetables. Thomas turned all 200 jars over to local health authorities for testing and proper disposal, rather than discarding them himself. The garage shelves remained empty, and the family never preserved food at home again. It was August 17, 2015. A cramped apartment in Stockton, California, sat quiet in the afternoon heat, curtains drawn against the summer sun. Inside, 2-year-old Noah Bennett played alone on the living room floor, while his mother sat slumped on the couch with an empty vodka bottle beside her. Noah was a typical toddler, energetic and curious, with no known medical conditions or developmental issues. His pediatric records showed he was slightly underweight, but otherwise healthy. Jessica, his mother, had been raising him alone since his father left 9 months earlier, working irregular shifts at a distribution warehouse while struggling with alcohol dependency. Child Protective Services had received 2 anonymous reports about her drinking, but closed both cases after brief home visits found no immediate danger. Friends described Jessica as overwhelmed and increasingly isolated, often appearing intoxicated during daytime hours. Young children lack the sophisticated swallowing mechanics adults possess. Their airways are narrower, approximately the diameter of a toddler's pinky finger, and their gag reflexes are less developed. Foods like whole grapes, hot dogs, and hard candies pose extreme choking risks because they can create complete airway obstructions that block all oxygen flow. Pediatric guidelines explicitly warn against giving children under 4 any food larger than a pea, or foods with tough, slippery skins that cannot be compressed. That afternoon, Jessica had been drinking since 11 in the morning. By 2:30 in the afternoon, she was severely intoxicated, her blood alcohol content later measured at 0.18%. She prepared Noah's lunch carelessly, placing a bowl of whole seedless grapes and thick-cut hot dog chunks on the coffee table before collapsing onto the couch. No supervision, no cutting the food into safe pieces. Noah, likely hungry and unsupervised, began eating while his mother passed out beside him. The apartment was silent except for the hum of a box fan. Noah sat cross-legged on the carpet, reaching for the grapes. At approximately 2:45 in the afternoon, he placed a whole grape in his mouth and attempted to swallow. The grape, measuring roughly 3/4 of an inch in diameter, lodged perfectly at the entrance to his airway, creating an airtight seal. There was no dramatic choking, no violent coughing. The complete obstruction prevented any air movement that would trigger those reflexes. Noah simply froze, his small hands moving to his throat. His face darkened from pink to deep red, then began turning dusky blue as oxygen deprivation progressed. He stood briefly, staggered 2 steps toward the couch, then collapsed onto his side beside the furniture. His mother remained unconscious throughout. Noah's brain had been deprived of oxygen for several minutes, leaving him unresponsive and leading to cardiac arrest. His small body lay on the carpet, fingers still slightly curled, while Jessica slept. Hours later, a neighbor who had come by to drop off a casserole peeked through the curtains and saw the toddler, immediately calling 911. Officers arrived shortly after and forced entry, and paramedics followed 4 minutes later, quickly determining that the child had been dead for hours. The medical examiner's autopsy revealed a single intact green grape wedged in the upper airway, completely blocking the passage of air. No food particles were found in the lungs. Cause of death was mechanical asphyxia due to foreign body airway obstruction. The warm apartment accelerated the onset of livor and rigor mortis, which investigators noted during the initial examination. Jessica was arrested that evening and charged with involuntary manslaughter and child endangerment resulting in death. The apartment was cleared within 48 hours. Noah's blue sippy cup remained on the floor near where he fell, collected as evidence along with the bowl of grapes. Thanks for watching. If you like these stories, click here.